Many of you already know Professor Pebley. I don't think she needs a long introduction. A couple of things. I mean, she's a distinguished professor at the Community Health Sciences at the Fielding School of Public Health and has a lot of experience doing research, but more importantly for today's topic, she has a very long track record of grant writing and funding. So I think she's really, we're really excited to have Anne giving us this workshop on grant writing. I couldn't think of anybody more, perhaps better to do this type of grant writing with the lots of experience that she has had over the years. So go ahead, Anne. I'm really happy to have you.
Thanks, Iram. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the brief introduction as opposed to a longer introduction. So let me see if I could share my screen. Does that work?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay. So I'm going to talk, I've got slides and everything, but I'm going to talk fairly informally. And so I really welcome people who've participated in producing a proposal, an NIH grant proposal, or reviewed them, or whatever, to please contribute to add what you have to say, because I don't have any corner on knowledge in this area, despite what Iram said. Everybody has somewhat different experience. And for those of you who are thinking about writing or submitting a proposal, please jump in with questions. The way I have my computer set up, I'm not going to see questions. So I think I would say two things. Please either just jump in, just say, hey, Anne, I want to say something, or, put it in the chat. And Iram, I would be grateful if you could just alert me if somebody has something to contribute and mentions it in the chat. So
sure, I'll keep track of the chat.
Okay, great. But feel free to jump in anytime, folks, because this is better as a collective exercise, and I wish we were in person. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about preparing an NIH grant proposal. It's a big topic. I won't cover a lot of things, but I will give you some kind of an idiosyncratic, I guess, perspective on it. And I'm going to mostly concentrate, since we are mostly demographers, social scientists, and public health researchers who work on social and behavioral research, but especially those who are working on social research as opposed to, say, mental health research or more traditional mental health research. I'm going to focus on how NIH interacts with us in terms of research funding. So let's see, I am not able to move my slides. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the whole process, of course, starts with a really good idea, a really good research idea. And that means to me a project that will answer important unanswered policy-related questions. Now, you might say, well, what about basic research? Basic research is also something that NIH funds, but you've got to make the case that it has an important significance. You can't just say, well, we're just curious about this. You need to make the case that it has a key significance, particularly for health. I mean, they fund a lot of things you wouldn't immediately think are health related, but ultimately you need to justify their longer term effect on health. So what I'm going to, and I'm specifically not going to be talking about good research ideas. That's all I'm going to say about them unless you bring it up. But I'm going to be talking about your situation if you have a good research idea, and how you might go about pursuing getting funding for it from NIH. So rather than talking immediately about writing your proposal, I'm going to start out with a brief introduction to NIH extramural funding, specifically what institutes and centers you should think about submitting your proposal to, talk a little bit about review groups and the review process, and also the funding cycle. And again, I'm going to focus specifically on the kinds of work that we do, and then I'll talk about writing a proposal. So, you look at this, this is a list from an NIH website on all of the institutes and centers that NIH has. And it's kind of like a parlor game, right? You spend your time saying, well, okay, who can guess what each one of these means, right? These are the initials of institutes and centers. And by the time you're done, you will probably know half of these initials, right? But you may not come to know all of them very well. And in fact, you'll typically have one or two institutes over the course of your lifetime which fund your research. But there are a lot of them that do fund research, that fund our research. And the important way to think about them is a lot of these institutes, or most of these institutes, this is a biomedical institution. We're social scientists kind of sneaking into a biomedical institution in a way. Although I think biomedical people recognize that what we do is increasingly recognize that it's important. Still, it's all structured according to sort of biomedical notions. And so the institutes are organized typically by disease or organ system, like the National Cancer Institute, the National Institute on Aging, Allergy Institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, so forth and so on. But within each institute, there are centers and branches, many of them, and some of them focus on the types of research that we do on social research. For example, the National Cancer Institute funds a fair amount of social and behavioral research. You just have to find which branch or which division funds what you're interested in doing. So for demographers and population people and social scientists in general, two sub groupings of particular institutes have funded much of our research traditionally. One is in NICHD, the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, and specifically their population dynamics branch. And I've shown you sort of a little screen capture of their page. The other one is the National Institute on Aging and their Behavioral and Social Research Division. And those are the two groups that almost all of our funding for people in CCPR would come from. So NICHD, for example, that group, the Population Dynamics Branch, funds the Population Center, the POP Center that we have, the P2C Center. So it provides basic core support to CCPR. NIA also provides kind of core support to centers, but they both fund a lot of the research that we do. Okay. But I should say I've also gotten research funding from other institutions. So the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences funded a part of a study I did. And some people have gotten funding, depending on what their research topic is, from other institutes. CCPR once had a training grant from NIGMS, the General Medical Sciences Institute. So don't give up on the other institutes, but these are the two that you'll primarily see funding our research, and probably the right places to start. So where do you think about submitting your proposal? Now, like I say, I'm ignoring the whole issue of where to come up with a good research idea and what it is. I'm assuming that you have a good research idea. Also, that it's somewhat fleshed out, and also that you're not really familiar with NIH. So a lot of us who have had NIH funding before would probably have some better sense of where we might go to send in a particular proposal on a particular topic. But, talking to funded researchers in your area, one of the great things about CCPR is you have access to a lot of other funded researchers who would be very happy to talk with you, if you catch them at the right time, about their own research and give you advice about your research and about where in NIH your research might get funded. They can also, a lot of people, including Iran Beltran Sanchez and Martha Bailey and Patrick Houveline and lots of other people have sat, Dora Costa sat on NIH review groups, reviewed a lot of proposals for NIH. And so they also have a very good inside feel for the whole process. So talk to them about your research and where it's likely to best be submitted. But you can also look at the branch or division's website. So this is, these are the priorities, the funding priorities for NICHD's population dynamics branch, which is traditionally funded demographic research and population research. And the funding priorities change. They revise their funding priorities on a regular basis. So, but currently their disparities in maternal and infant morbidity and mortality all the way down to contraceptive use and non-use. So it's not, perhaps it's not exactly what you'd think it would be. There's not a lot of migration in here, but in fact, they do fund migration-related research. But these are the things they particularly want to fund. So one that I find interesting is health, disease, and development across the lifespan. So this is in an institute that is focused on children, okay? And the reason they're interested in, if you go back and read their website, the reason they're interested in across the lifespan is because they think that intergenerational effects can be very important. And so parents, and particularly mothers' health and development can affect the next generation of children. So that opens the scope for research, not just on children, but on a broad swath of age groups. Okay, so take a look and read what their website, the particular group that you're looking at, what their website says. Also, I recommend people look at the acknowledgements. This is a kind of a weird thing, but look at the acknowledgements sections of published papers on your topic. So you're going to be doing a literature review anyway. Look at the empirical papers and see who funded that research. And sometimes that's a red herring and will lead you in the wrong direction, but sometimes it can be quite useful. So that's a good idea. And what you'll find on the NIH advice pages, which I also endorse, is once you've sort of narrowed in on a group at NIH, or if you decide, for example, to go to one of the two groups that we typically go to, email or call the program officers in the branch or division that you're considering and ask them about, tell them about the topic of your project and what you're planning to do, and ask them if that fits into the kinds of things they're interested in. Do they have suggestions and ideas about it? It's perfectly legitimate, as I'll explain in a minute, because they are not the people who review your proposals. They are in an advantageous position to give you advice about your proposals. They ultimately have to rely on a peer-reviewed group to score your proposals, to rate your proposals or your proposal. So they're not, talking to them, you have to be a little careful because they're ultimately the people who have to argue once they get the scores, as I'll explain, in favor of your proposal, but they are not directly involved in the review, so they can give you advice. So people are often hesitant to call program officers. Program officers are people like everybody else. Some are kind and friendly and some are more difficult, but that's something you can learn from talking to other researchers around you. But it's worth talking to them anyway to kind of give them a heads up about what you're doing, who you are, what's going on, and to, let them know what you're interested in. Shall I pause here for any questions, thoughts, additions? Anybody?
Are you gonna describe a little bit more the RFAs?
Yes, I'll
Okay.
talk a little bit about RFAs, but feel free to jump in, Yoram, because I may not talk enough.
I'll wait then when you touch on that
Okay.
topic.
Okay.
Actually, I
So,
have a question.
sure, please.
First, hi, Anne.
Hey,
Hi,
Magali,
here
how
I
are
am.
you? Long time no see.
Patrick. Yes. So I actually submitted a couple of proposals, but I'm still really confused about the whole process and operation and everything. So one of my puzzle is when you submit to one of the institute, but you don't really, there is nowhere in the assist system where you can put in the branch or the division you're applying to, right? So
Well,
how do you, so do you put that? So I ended up putting it in my cover letter that I wanted to be reviewed by, I don't remember what it's called, the review group SSBP or something like that,
yeah,
and SSA.
SSPA or SSPB, yeah.
Right. Can you say a couple of words about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Magali. That's a very good
Sure.
question. So I'll talk about review groups in a minute, but you probably want to indicate. So the only way that I know of to indicate your preferences, what branch you're interested in having a proposal go to, I think there are two things you can do. One is the branch is usually associated with a particular review group, as I'll say in a minute. And you, in your cover letter, which is technically written by your institution, but you can ask your institution, you write the words and ask the institution to include it in your cover letter. You can ask specifically to have your proposal referred to a given review group. And that's a good idea. If you know what review group you want, that's a good idea. Secondly, you should also send a copy of your proposal when you submit it. Send a copy to the program officer at the branch or division that you want to have consider the proposal, because then and tell them it's just been submitted, because then they'll know that if they're interested, they can go out and grab it and make sure it's assigned to their branch.
Thanks. That's very, listen everyone, because that's not something you'll find, on the website or anything.
I'll
So
tell you
really
a quick story about that. The first grant proposal I ever submitted to NICHD I was naive and didn't know what I was doing, and it went to an epidemiology study section who thought it was terrible. I'm a study section review group. I'm using the words interchangeably. They thought it was terrible and just gave it a horrible score. I, at the advice of a program officer and some colleagues, got it back, changed the title, put on some new administrative pages, sent exactly the same proposal back, asked for the right study section in the cover letter, and it was funded. Now, that's a really extreme case. It will probably not happen to you, but it's much better to make sure you've got your proposal correctly situated. You don't have full control over it, but it's better to use the influence that you have.
Well, actually, the exact same thing happened to me, because I submitted to mechanism that's called UO1.
Yeah.
You know about that? Okay. So I did that before the summer. It was an emergency process for COVID-related research. And my proposal, because I was planning to look at race and ethnic differentials in COVID-19, my proposal ended up with the National Institute of Minority Health and Disparities, something like that.
Right.
And because of this process, there is no extramural review. It's all done in-house. There is no feedback. So I wasn't even told that my proposal had been selected first and then rejected at the second round. And then I realized they only funded one proposal, and they're very anthropologically oriented.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So I resubmitted. Yeah. So I was.
You resubmitted and got funded.
Well, not yet. We'll see. As a R1 to NIH.
Fingers crossed. Okay, so I'm going to move along just so everybody knows what Magali and I are talking about. So one thing you have to understand about NIH, which is not, which is described in detail in NIH pages trying to help people figure out how to submit proposals, but I find it a little opaque, is that there are two parts to the extramural funding process at NIH. There's a whole other part. I mean, there are many other things NIH does, but in terms of extramural funding, there are two things. One is the program staff. Those are the people I've been talking about in the branches and divisions. And those are the people you can call who can give you advice. What they do is they're, PhD social science researchers, just like the rest of us at least, or PhD or MD researchers in other divisions. But in the two divisions we typically deal with, they've got degrees just like us. Some of them are former fellow students or whatever. So those folks decide on funding priorities for the program as a whole. Okay, and they get them approved through the chain of command. And so, but they're the ones who decide these are the key funding priorities that this program is going to fund. Okay. And again, doesn't end with them. They have to get approval and so forth. They're also the people who ultimately have the money. They get the budget. Okay. So the money goes to them. And so they're important people. Okay. And they ultimately get to decide who it is that does get funding, but they have to base their decisions on scores and reviews that are determined by this completely other group, an independent group that reviews proposals. And also on another group that we typically ignore, which is a second tier, it's a higher tier research group, review group called the Council, which is the Council for the Institute. And I'm not going to talk much about Council, but you'll hear, this went through the study section and got a fundable score. And we're really thinking it's going to get funded, but we have to go to Council, and then Council has to agree. Okay. So I can talk more about that later, but I'm not going to talk about it now. The program staff are not permitted to participate in the scientific review process in any way. It's supposed to be completely separate from them, except they can go observe it. And sometimes they can go observe it. There are very clear, tricky rules. Because they're not involved in the review process, they can give applicants advice on applications and strategies. Okay, that's the way to think about it. They have a big role in whether you get funded or not, but their role is entirely based on the review. Okay, once they get the reviews back, they might be able to push a project a little up or a little down, depending on whether it meets with their funding priorities, but not much. Okay, so how does the review occur? Well, there's this other entity within NIH called the Center for Scientific Review. And they have standing, which means like people serve on them for a couple, 3 to 4 years at a time, or special purpose independent peer review groups, which are sometimes called study sections. Study sections, I think, are the old term, and review groups is the new term. These groups are, like I said, I've sat on many of them. Iram and Martha Bailey both sat on special purpose groups this month or last month. Other people, so look around you, and the people around you typically are the people on the peer review groups. So it's not some odd group of people sitting off somewhere in a, different place. They're just like us, although they are not necessarily all in the same field as we are, right? If you can go, so I've given you the link here at the bottom to look at SSPA, which is the social science and population group A's membership. You can also, if you use that same link and just put B at the end instead of A, you can look at the social science and population review group B membership, and you'll see they're just, they're just researchers like us. So they go through a process where, three people, I mean, we can talk about this in more detail too, but three people read the proposal, the whole group, and then they have a discussion, the whole group gives scores to each proposal, and they give scores on each section of the proposal. So when we talk about the specific sections of the proposal, it's really important that you do a good job on each section because you're going to get a score on each section and they add up to your total score. So the review groups typically used by these two branches I highlighted are called Social Science and Population Group A and Group B. They used to be called the Social Science and Population Study section. It was all one, but it got split. So you can go look at the memberships of the groups. So these groups produce essentially numerical scores, right? Plus reviews, which you will get a copy of, which go back to the program staff. And based on those numerical scores, the program staff will decide, just lining them up, right? Which ones will get funded and not funded. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so now let me talk about the issue that Iran brought up, and let's see what my next slide is. Yeah, let me talk about that issue. So Iran brought up the issue of RFAs, requests for applications. So as I'll say in a couple minutes, most proposals that are sent in, most research proposals that are sent to NIH and are funded are not in response to a particular call for proposals on the part of NIH. They're investigator initiated. They're proposals that the research community members think are important, projects they think they're important, that are essentially unsolicited. Okay, now, if something comes in that's completely, orthogonal to the funding priorities of the program that it goes into, then the staff can say, look, this is fine, you can go review it, but not in my, it's not going to be funded by my program, right? But sometimes, so most things are unsolicited. You don't have to sit and wait for a call for proposals on your particular topic. There's a whole issue of program announcements and so forth, but your administrative folks can help you with that. But occasionally an agency or a group like the Population Dynamics branch or the Behavioral Science, Behavior and Social Research branch will decide they're interested in a particular topic and they'll put out something called an RFA, request for application. Or sometimes it's a PAR, which is a program announcement. I don't know what the R stands for. Does anybody know what the R stands for? We'll leave it. So it's both of those, especially the RFAs, they are a special pot of money that are put aside for research on this particular issue. Keep an eye out for RFAs. Don't wait to submit a proposal waiting for an RFA. But if you see an RFA, it's a terrific thing to apply for because typically it's a one-time deal. And in my experience, I hate to say it, but it's easier to get funding from an RFA because people have short time horizons to write the proposal. And proposals that I've reviewed that come in for RFAs are often not as good as the regular unsolicited proposals. But there's a downside, which is that those proposals that come in response to an RFA have special purpose independent peer review groups usually. And so essentially it's complicated because you get a one shot at that review group. If that review group doesn't like it, then there's a whole complicated process that gets started. But basically, I guess my message is look out for RFAs because they're really good funding opportunities. And if it's in your area and you are doing something that would fit in that RFA and you have the time to write the proposal, it's worth doing it. Because I think your funding chances are better. Yoram, did you want to say something more about
I think
RFAs?
Mark might have a question. Mark, you wanted
Mark,
to say
please.
something?
Who, me? Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah, one of the drawbacks of an RFA, in my opinion, my experience, is that it doesn't allow for a revise and resubmission. So that's a huge loss. But, what many investigators, including myself, have done is just turn to the parent R01 and resubmit it later on. So that is, many people use that mechanism, and so it's not a lost cause after being turned down the first time. The RFAs are very competitive, and well, most announcements are competitive, but without the possibility of resubmitting it, that's hugely problematic, and you really have to do a wonderful job. But yeah. So.
Yeah, Mark, that's great, because that's exactly what I was trying to avoid going into in detail, but you've said it very succinctly. So that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
So, a typical unsolicited proposal, if you get a poor review, you can revise it and resubmit it. And the good thing is you'll submit it to the same review group. So the same people who gave you the bad review will review it again and hopefully love it this time because you answered their responses. With RFAs, that's not true. You get this special review group, they disband after they do their review. And, but as Mark says, you can then turn around and submit it as an unsolicited proposal and get the standard review group, which is another strategy.
And one other point that I was going to
Sure.
say, and I know we've moved on beyond the composition of the study section, but it is a fact that quite often you will look up the list, the roster, and it's not really the roster that's going to review your grant. So you need to be a little bit careful about that.
Yes.
Because quite often they will invite experts to join as temporary members, and I have seen study sections where half of the roster is made up of people who are there on a temporary basis. So just a cautionary note about assuming that what you might see at CSR is indeed what will be reviewing you when your proposal goes through CSR.
Absolutely. That's a really, really good point. That's a really good point. Yoram, did you have things you wanted to say about an RFA?
Yeah, this is related to what Mark just said, that as you already indicated, and there is a standing group of committee members for the review sessions, or the review panels, but they invite what Mark was referring to, ad hoc reviewers, which are experts that will participate in that particular review. Mm-hmm. So, and those experts, you don't know ahead of time who they would be until the NIH officers get the grants and start inviting people who they think might be experts to evaluate those grants.
Absolutely. No, those are really, really good points.
Sorry to interject.
No, not at all.
But quite often some junior colleagues will ask, well, how do I acquire experience? Well, CSR has a program underway where you can actually interact with them, and they are always recruiting more junior, less experienced grant applicants. So that's a great experience, and I think the best experience here, is being able to participate on one of the review panels.
I think that's a terrific point, and I really, I strongly, strongly urge you. I mean, it's some work, but I strongly urge you to participate. The way I learned actually to become much better at writing proposals was to serve as a study section member, as a review group member. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's a great point, Mark. Okay, anybody else? All right. So I think this is a really important point. Who's the key audience for your proposal? Well, you have to fit within the priorities of the program. So you should make sure you're fitting within the priorities. But you should write the proposal for the peer review panel, though, as Mark says very clearly, not for specific reviewers. Anybody who sat on a review panel will tell you that they've heard from other people that you're not supposed to do this, but they've heard from other people how, they really appreciate the fact that this person boosted their proposal, or that this person trashed their hated that this person trashed their proposal. I've had people tell me, "Oh, you were really a terrible reviewer. You trashed my proposal," when I had not even, when I was a review group member, not even read the proposal. So don't write for specific reviewers, both because you don't know who's going to be assigned to the proposal, but also, as Mark says, often other people are assigned, other experts are brought in. And some of the people you think might be there may not be able to make the meeting. So just don't do that. But write the proposal for the peer review panel, in the sense that you should think about not administrative staff, even if they have PhDs and research training. You should think about writing a proposal for your colleagues or for professors at your institution. Okay. And these reviewers may or may not be specialists in the area. Some are going to be specialists in your area, probably. Others are going to be people who really don't know much about it. They're going to be good researchers, but they may not know much about your area. So you have to write in a way that's going to be able to explain what you're doing to both. Okay. And reviewers and review groups, one thing that I think is really important is that they develop particular tastes and preferences. And I guess I would say this about research disciplines, particular tastes and preferences about key research or methodological issues. So in the social science and population review groups, as in our fields, for example, typically people are really concerned about making inferences from data. Okay, so they're really worried about, reviewers are going to be really worried about, are your data representative of the population that you want to make inferences to? Okay. Are they collected in a way that are going to allow you to make those inferences? Is the data quality good? What about spurious relationships? What about endogeneity and unobserved heterogeneity or unobserved influences? Those are going to be issues that are, if you go to SSPA or B, are going to come up with high probability. So you need to be thinking about them in advance. It doesn't mean, the fact that an issue is going to come up doesn't mean you should torpedo a particular project. It means that you need to think about how to address that issue as part of your project. Okay, and we can talk about ways to do it. But as I say, the SSP study sections, just like every other study section, have particular tastes and preferences. If you were going to a psychology study section, the child development study section, for example, you might get reviewers who are very concerned about specific kinds of measurements of children's development indicators and the fights within their field about which ones measure what. I'm not in the field, so I'm sort of making it up, but that's what I would get. So you see what I mean? It's worth understanding what kinds of issues and thinking about them as you're writing that are likely to come up among reviewers in your area. Another one I should mention that is really important and has come up for a lot of people, not surprisingly lately, has been whether you're thinking about equity issues, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. And if not, why not? Or what are you going to do about it? And that's really important. Okay, let me move on to talk about types of NIH grants.
Let me just very
Please.
quickly and mention, now that you indicated that equity issue, it is now a part of the review criteria, if you will, that we look at whether the researchers justify the inclusion or exclusion of certain groups. For instance, the inclusion of male or females. If they're going to focus only on one group or the other, has to be a justification. You can just decide to do it. If there is an exclusion of certain groups, for instance, some people might look at older adults, there has to be justification why you're using certain cutoff and leaving other people out. So all those things have to be now part of the writing. You cannot just assume that just because of data issues, I'm just going to drop these people. I'm only going to focus on those. Have to be justified.
Right. And that's really important. That's been true for a while, but I'm on top of that now. I think study sections are increasingly, at least social science related study sections, review groups are increasingly concerned about whether in the design of the project, in addition to the groups you're including, you're thinking about issues of systemic racism and discrimination, and how those issues might affect the processes that you're looking at. So there are two levels, right? There's a level which has to do with inclusion or exclusion of groups, and another level which has to do with how you think about these issues with regard to the theory and approach of your research. But that's, again, this is just an example of the tastes and preferences issue within. I'm sure there are review groups that are not thinking of that, despite the fact they probably should be. So, okay, types of NIH grants. So I'm mostly going to be talking about research grants, which are R grants, designated as R grants. In fact, I'm primarily going to be talking about R01s, which are full-size research grants, in the sense that you can apply for sizable projects. Typically, they're 3 to 5 years long. They can be shorter. They have budget limits, but it's pretty big. And so you can do a lot of work with R01 funding, Then there are R03s, which are small grants, depending on what you think small is and your salary. They may or may not be small for faculty members who've been around for, in the field for a long time. That $100,000 doesn't cover much salary, because remember, that's not just, well, it doesn't cover a lot, let me put it that way. But small grants can be incredibly, incredibly useful when you're starting out and you want to demonstrate that a new project, you want to do a pilot project or demonstrate, that a new procedure would be useful, or gather pilot data, or even, depending on the salaries of the people involved, cover some time. So R21 is, in theory, for innovative or developmental projects. I'd be interested in what people say, but also for kind of medium-sized types of projects, I find, because they have funding limits. But I think people often use them as larger than small grants, but less onerous than R01s. Mark?
Yeah, I think I don't know if you said this or not, but the new and early stage investigator status for R01s is really critical, and I think many less seasoned investigators often overlook that. So it's
Absolutely.
really critical, and that the pay line, it will be a little bit different, and so many institutes have set aside money specifically for new investigators or early stage investigators. So that's really an important point that I think sometimes is overlooked.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point. New investigators are people who haven't had an R01. So if you've had an R03 or other kinds of research, other kinds of grants, that's fine. You can still apply, as I remember, for an R01, but you get a preference, which you should take advantage of.
Exactly.
So let's see, Janie.
I just have a quick question. We have an NIH R34 grant through NIMH. Could you just distinguish for me the difference between R34 and like an R03 or R21?
So I'll be honest with you and say I don't know much about R34s.
Okay.
Does anyone else does anyone else have?
R34s are usually planning grants. So they're not a traditional R01. It's a different purpose. So it might lead to a bigger project. That's how they're designed. So very different purpose than an R01. Very different than an R01. Let's put it that way.
But
yeah,
how would,
I definitely know they're different than R01. I was curious, like why an R34 versus an R21 or
Well, here's
an
what it says.
R03.
Here's what NIH says. I just looked it up. It says an NIH planning grant program R34s provides support for the initial development of a clinical or research project.
Whereas R21s are supposed to be, I mean, they were originally designed to be, you had a really great opportunity for something innovative
Yeah.
and you just needed, a modest amount of money.
Right, but I'm a huge fan of R21s. I think
Me
the
too.
developmental exploratory nature of the grant is different from the other two. It's different dimensions of grant, and it could be a little bit more experimental. It doesn't require you don't have to have preliminary data as you often do for an R01. So R21s, I think it's a good stepping stone for somebody who's considering an R01. In fact, I would start out with an R03, move up to an R21, and then go for an R01.
I think that's good advice. Patrick?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say about the R03. One of the advantages is that it is a stepping stone. I think it is seen as a stepping stone. So it might not be enough money to buy a course out, for example, depending on what your salary is. But I think for junior investigator, because it's not a lot of money, if your score is not too far from the pay line, the program officer might actually squeeze you in because if it's not a huge grant, they have more leverage to do that. And I think when you apply for an R01, the fact that it might be building on an R03, I mean, it was my case, was seen as a positive. Right? Reviewers said that it was actually following an R03, so it was, in a way, NIH like to see that its investment is paying into good R1 application. So I think I would encourage junior, new investigators in NIH parlance to consider starting with an R3.
Yeah, I agree.
Terrific. Ian?
Yeah, I just have a question about strategy. So it seems like they prioritize new investigators who are like submitting their R01 the first time. But it also seems like as a junior person, it would be helpful to co-write the grant with like senior people who know what they're doing. And so maybe I misunderstand this, but I wonder how you weigh those two like benefits.
Well, can I just add
Please,
something?
Mark, go ahead.
Well, first of all, if you're going to, you have to be a little bit careful because there are certain rules regarding using it as a new investigator to get all, take advantage of that. You have to be the sole PI, although I understand that there might be some multiple PI arrangement where you have another junior person going in as another PI on the grant, but you can't have a senior person and a junior person submitting a grant as an MPI arrangement. That's my understanding. But you can always have, I think what NIH and CSR panels like to see is that if you're relatively junior, that you have somebody more senior who's acting as a de facto mentor on the project. They often will comment, and I've commented in my reviews, that this grant application was submitted by an assistant professor, but had somebody really senior on that project who was going to help them, guide them through the research process. So there's a lot that goes into these grants. It's not just applying. You have to establish a team. You have to identify people, and having somebody more senior with expertise and experience in the area you're focusing on is a definite plus.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah.
It also depends a little bit on what you're planning to do, what the project is, but you need to be the PI. I mean, that's the bottom line. Ian, does that answer the question?
Yeah, that answers the question. Like you can
Okay.
have others involved and still have the junior person as the PI.
Yeah, and that's to protect the junior person in part. Okay.
There are a
So-
couple of questions.
I'm
One
sorry.
from- yeah,
Go ahead, Jordan.
questions from Angu that let's see, at what stage or our careers do we apply for each of these different grants? And if, for example, she says, if you are in a tenure track career, at what stage should you begin planning working on an R01 or R21? So any comments on that?
I think that's hard, Angu, to say. I mean, I would say, earlier is always better, to get started. I think people are often so reluctant to do this that they sit there and worry about it rather than get moving. I think the crucial thing is uh, what Mark proposed as a sort of trajectory is a good one, that you think about starting with an RO3 grant. It's actually, so the proposal is 6 pages, right, Iram and
Yes,
Mike?
6
Yeah.
Mark?
pages.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
the
it's
same for
6
the
pages.
R21.
Right, so it's 6 pages, R21, 6 pages. It's easier to write. You get a little bump in potentially in writing it. It could help you write an R01. What you need to have is a really good research idea, but don't wait till you're coming up with the most brilliant thing on the face of the earth. You could talk yourself out of it really easily. I think the crucial thing is to have an idea you want to pursue and really move forward on it. I've had people who were graduate students who worked on RO3s. If I were a graduate student, I think I might consider instead some of the F series, which I'm not going to be talking about, which are like there's a postdoc fellowship in the F
Mhm.
series, because that gives you some funding, and then there's a K series, postdoc K99 ROO, which is a complicated mechanism. But those are, if I were a graduate student, those are the ones I would consider, partly because there's a separate pot of funding for some of them, and partly because they involve additional training and are a little easier to write.
Yeah.
But so I don't think there's specific stages. Mark, did you have some
Yeah, I was
comment?
going to say something else because not much has been said about the what is a successful R1. It's not just get, or excuse me, an RO3 or R21, and that is you have to generate publications, good publications. That is something that the committees will value. If you simply argue that, well, you've had an R03, therefore you're ready for an R21 or R01,
Right.
I don't think that's going to cut it. So it's important
No.
that you think of, as you're writing the grant, how many publications, what you're going to be publishing, where you're going to be publishing, all those things that, trying to publish impactful work that will help you the next time you go up for a, say an R01, if that's the aim.
Right. Anyone else, Hiram? I don't
Mhm.
see any. Okay, so let me move along. So, is that what I wanted to do next? All right, well, that's what I'm going to do because I can't seem to go back. So, just to, I mean, again, this is very sketchy, but just to let you know, so there are two parts to an NIH grant proposal. And usually when you read the NIH instructions, they talk quite a bit about both, but especially about the administrative part. And the problem is, you read that and you think, oh God, how do I do all this? I've had so many people do that. But the great thing about being at a university, especially one that's used to applying for research grants along with researchers, is that a lot of that administrative part you don't have to worry about, will be completed by staff at the university. And those of us who are CCPR members are particularly lucky because CCPR has a absolutely terrific staff who are experts at doing this. And they will also help you figure out which pieces you need to do, but they will take care of the majority of the administrative part. So when you look at the NIH pages, don't say, oh, don't be daunted about all of that stuff because you don't have to do most of it. The parts that you will need to help out with are the budget. You don't have to put it in NIH format. That's what the administrative people will help you do, but you do need to plan it and think very carefully about it. And then you'll need to go through many revisions of the budget, thinking about making sure you have the funding you need and so forth. Biosketches. One thing I'll say about biosketches is in the past several years, there's a paragraph at the top of the biosketch which describes, in which you can write a sort of a little narrative about you and why, your involvement in this research and why it's important. And use that for everything you can. I mean, make the case there about how you've done work in this area before, why it's important, what this is going to contribute. Also use the rest of the bio sketch to talk about why the research that you've done is important. It's not the same as a CV. They've changed the format very substantially. And the bio sketch is what a lot of reviewers who have no idea who you are will use to assess whether, you're a productive person, whether you're working on important issues. So don't just leave it for the end. Make sure that you're writing it, as if you really care about it, because you should. Okay, and the project summary and narrative are just little pieces you have to write. So the thing you should concentrate on is the research plan. And I just want to say a few parts about the research plan, and then I will stop and we can see if I can get my, okay. Yep. Okay. So again, I'm going to be talking about an RO1. Okay. If you're thinking about an RO3, you can think, okay, this is very similar, but it's going to be 6 pages. Okay. So the research plan is 12 pages. Well, that sounds like not a lot, right? But it's actually a lot because you have, it used to be 25 pages, and I would often have trouble fitting everything into 25 pages, not because I'm particularly verbose, but because of the level of detail you need to include. But this 12 pages is single space with wide margins in 11 point. And so you'll have a pretty large amount of room, and you will need it. It's not like, you don't have to go padding the proposal in any way. You don't have to fill the 12 pages, but you're most likely write more than 12 pages and need to cut. So this is just you've probably seen this before. This is just the outline of a research plan. So there's a specific aims, which is 1 page long. We'll talk about it I'll say more about it in a minute. The research strategy, which has 3 sections: significance, innovation, which are very important, and approach, which is also very important. So all these sections are crucial. I put, if you've done preliminary research in this area, which often you will have, I include that in the approach section. The approach section also includes the background, a literature review, which is not just vanilla sorted literature review, right? It's got to be a very pointed literature review, which explains what we know about the specific questions you want to answer and what we don't know. What we don't know is actually even more important, because you're trying to persuade the readers that there are big holes or substantial holes in the literature that you're going to fill by this project. Okay. And then you talk in detail, and I'll say more about this, about how you're going to fill them, and then their references and human subjects and inclusion sections.
Can I just add
Please,
something?
Mark.
Well, I was going to say that, and I think you made a reference to this, and it is sometimes tough, but it's possible that as you're writing, you think about the reader as well. You think about somebody who's
Trust me,
excuse me?
that's what's coming next.
Oh, okay. You want them to lift language from your text when they write their critiques.
This
And
is great, because this is like pre-confirmation of what I'm going to say. So
okay,
please
all
go
right.
ahead.
Okay. So that's all I want to say is that it's a dialogue that you have going in your head with how is the reviewer going to perceive this, and going back and
Absolutely.
forth, and that's really critical. So it's not just writing, and it's takes numerous drafts until it's done, and it's
Absolutely. So I'll come back to talk about that in a minute. But okay, so here's some general tips, and I'll finish with this. One is start early. I've seen too many people say, oh, there's a date a couple weeks from now, I'm going to submit my proposal. I will not use the words I was planning to use because I don't think I want to say them in a public audience, but that's nonsense. Don't think about that. That's just going to, especially for your first proposal, that's just going to lead to garbage. So give yourself at least a couple months to get it written, and maybe more, depending. I mean, if you're doing data collection, you need more time. So plan well in advance. Read other grant proposals, especially successful ones, and you can get them, again, if you're a CCPR member at another population center, don't be shy. Ask other people if you could borrow their proposals and read them and, outline them. Look at how they've handled issues. Don't just read them for the sort of substantive content. Look at how they've dealt with difficult problems and look at the level of detail that they put in. The NCI, the National Cancer Institute, also puts up some sample applications. And there are a couple there that would be good models for the kinds of applications that we write. I mean, some of them just aren't because they're doing very different kinds of research. But take a look, read as many as you can. And again, pay attention to the wording that people are using, the structure, and how they deal with limitations of their study, how they justify what they're doing. Then I'd say this is like personal management, right? Pick a specific date several months out when you can clear the decks and stick to that date. Just do it. Don't say, oh, well, maybe I'll do it. You really got to get moving or you won't do it. I can say more about that, but I won't. Okay, so this you can go find on the web. There for R01s, but also every other type of R and every other type of grant, there are specific dates 3 times a year, which are deadlines by which you can submit grant applications. I don't think I'll go, for RFAs or for other types of grant applications, there are other dates. They specify what dates they're required. But there are these 3 times a year you can submit them, but you can submit it early. You don't have to submit it right before the due date, and your administrative staff will thank you very much if you don't wait till the last minute. Okay. And keep in mind also when you're planning the project that there is this cycle, right? So if you submit it, say, February 5th, it's going to get reviewed in June or July. It's not going to get reviewed tomorrow, right? It'll get reviewed in June or July. It'll go to the council, okay, the second review body, in August, between August to October. And the earliest time you could start the project, if you submit it February 5th, is in September or December. And with a high probability, you may have to submit it again. So you shouldn't count on getting it funded within a year for the most part. Now, you may get lucky, but you shouldn't count on it. So that's part of planning well in advance. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about that, but let me just finish my tips. So one thing you should do as early as you can in thinking about your project, and you'll do it many times, is identify specific methodological or design issues that you're going to have, particularly if you're collecting data, but even if you're not, and get help solving them. I mean, one of the things I learned so much, I'm a relatively polite person, and in writing these proposals, I learned that I have to ask for help. You just don't have a choice. Okay, you really got to get help, and colleagues give each other help, and mentors give each other help. Okay, they give their students and other people help. So you've got to identify what kind of help you need, what kind of problems you're going to run into as early as you can, and identify who can help you solve them and start talking to that person. Also talk to colleagues. This is supposed to be colleagues, not colleague, and your NIH program officer early to make sure you're on the right track in terms of what to submit it to, and then get your UCLA staff, CCPR staff, or your departmental staff to help you early on the administrative paperwork. They would really appreciate knowing as soon as possible what, that you're going to submit this proposal so they can get started, because there's a lot of work on their part. Okay, and then tips on specific sections. And I think, so let me just do this. So to Mark's point, your most important goal in writing the proposal is to make the reviewer's job easy. I can't emphasize this enough. Think about the poor reviewers. It's like a colleague or a professor who's, teaching classes, trying to write her own grant proposals, doing research. She's got a full-time job, and now she's got 10 or 12 grant proposals in front of her, and she's trying to read them perhaps late at night. She hasn't gotten enough sleep. Her child is bothering her. You can get the picture, right? I mean, there's a lot going on in the life of a reviewer. They're not just like cradling your proposal and, willing to sort through all your language. Forget it. You want to make their job as easy as possible. Reviewers have essentially forms they need to fill out. Okay, they need to fill out forms which say, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each section in bullet points? Okay, so you know what you can do? You can tell them what they should fill in. They may not agree, they may fill in something else. And you're obviously not going to tell them the weaknesses exactly, but give them language that they can use. Okay, don't bury the lead, right? So make sure, I'll give you an example in terms of innovation. Well, maybe I'll do it now. I mean, so here's my example. This is from a proposal we wrote. So there's a whole section on innovation, right? But I had in that section, in bold type, the specific innovations. There are 5 specific innovations from this project. They are first, second, third, and then a reviewer can decide if they want to essentially copy that language if they agree, or maybe they don't think that's such an innovation and they don't copy it, or they write their own thing. But you give them the opportunity, right? And you make it easy to read, and you put it in words that are very clear cut and really good at selling why this is innovative. Don't just talk about, oh, this is really great. And that doesn't help. Okay. So make the reviewer's job easy. And that's what you should do for every section. Make it easy to find things, make it very clear what it is that you are going to do and what they should write. Okay. So in specific aims, I'd say, what do you do in specific aims? You talk about why the topic is important. Very briefly, you talk about what you're going to do. And then you need 2 to 5, and I like the number 3. I mean, that's 5, right? But I like the number 3. Specific questions. Don't just say, I'm going to investigate blah, blah, blah. Okay, don't do that. Say, here is these are the 3 questions at the end of this project that I'm going to have the answers to. And those of you who've taken a class with me or worked with me know I often say this, but put them in the form of a question, right? Because that's a good discipline. Okay, I want to leave some time, so I want to just do this quick. With the significance, you need very concrete and persuasive language about why the question matters and why the project matters. Don't give me a bunch of mush. Tell me why it matters. why does it, outside of the research world, why do we care about this stuff? Okay, not even necessarily your project, but why is the topic important? And as I've said, what specific innovative contributions are you going to make? Okay, it needs to be really specific. And then just about research aims. Okay, I think one way to think about what the level of detail you need is you need, and again, don't let this be daunting. You can do it, but you have to start early and do it. So the way to think about it is to describe the methods and procedures of the proposed study in the level of detail that's even greater than you would in a paper that you write after the study's finished. So you write a paper after the study and describe what you did in the study, and you talk about sample size, and you talk about how collected the data, and how the methods used and all that. That's the level of detail you start with. You're essentially making it up, right? You're constructing it as you go along, but you need even more detail than that. Now, I'm an old contract administrator, federal government contract administrator. So I can tell you that this is a grant, not a contract. Okay, so NIH program officers know that they're giving you money, and the language specifically says this, to do your best job to conduct this study. So they know that you may not be able to do things, and it maybe sometimes would not be advisable to do things exactly the way you propose. Okay, but what reviewers want is to see if you could do things today exactly the way you propose, what would you do? How many cases would there be? What are the hypotheses? What are the, equations you're going to use? Okay. What are how are you going to, et cetera. So you need to come up with all the details. I can't emphasize that enough. Second is, don't attempt to cover up limitations and problems. That really gets people in trouble. I mean, don't ignore them. Rather, it's important to recognize them. I mean, as a reviewer, I'm really thrilled when somebody says, listen, this is a problem, but here's a solution that I've developed. I've thought about this problem, and I have a solution which either deals with the problem or helps me understand how this problem will affect my results, helps me know how to interpret my results. Okay. And again, I've said this before, pay attention to key research, theoretical and methodological issues that in this field, right? Like representativeness, inference, endogeneity, et cetera, right? Because those are things that are undoubtedly going to be in the reviewer's mind. After you have a draft, get colleagues, mentors to read it, put it aside for a while, then reread it and figure out where the problems are. This is where you put, as Mark says, you put the reviewer's hat on and you say, okay, suppose I have to write a negative review of this proposal. What would I write about? And then you rewrite the proposal, and you're going to do this multiple times. Okay? And actually, at the end, you're going to be happy because, you go back and read the proposal and it's actually pretty good. So that's it.
And Mark here. I'm not sure you said anything about the point system, the scoring system.
Yeah, I haven't said anything about it. So
But-
please,
but-
why don't you talk about it?
I think that's important. I think that you need to be thinking about that from the get-go, because it really does get at the question of impact. And there are three levels of impact that CSR NIH is looking for, and that is, well, they're looking for the highest impact possible. But scores range from 1 to 9, with 1 being the highest, the best, 9 being the lowest. And my experience, and I'm sure others might be able to share this with me, and that is that the funded projects are those that receive scores between 3 and 1. It's rare for something to get funded with a higher score than that. So
I
think
should interrupt to say, when you say higher, this is always, higher means numerically lower.
numerically lower. That's right. It's why it was done that way is beyond me, but it is what it is. And so a one means the best score possible, and perfect score. So I think as when you're drafting an application, I think it's important to think about impact, the impact that this work's going to have. Not just answering a question, but having some impact on the community of scholars, on something. So that's my advice. And those score, that 9 point scores chart is posted online. You can go to NIH and look at it. But I think it's really critical to pay attention to the way reviewers are going to assess, critiques are going to come back to you with a score. Hopefully, a score. And I know you haven't said anything about those applications that are discussed and scored. Half are not, and that's unfortunate. Half are scored, and sometimes those scores are so far from being a fundable score that it might be worth reconsidering the resubmission of that application.
Thank you. So what questions or other comments do we have?
Any other comments,
Well,
questions?
maybe just on that last point, I think it really depends on the comments. So even if your application is not scored and not discussed, you still get the reviews from the 3 people, at least 3, who've actually read the proposal. And it could be something really drag your application score down, but it's addressable. And I had an application that went from undiscussed to funded in the next cycle. So I think it really depends on
That certainly happens. It's rare.
Yeah, but if it's a conceptual thing, then I guess if they really don't like the proposal, they don't really think it's significant or it's going to do much, then that's that. But if there's something that maybe you didn't explain very well, and you think you can do better, it doesn't mean you can't absolutely resubmit something that wasn't discussed the first time.
I actually have a question about more fundamental issue, which is what happens if 2 proposals deal with the same topic, which is something I'm concerned about because this proposal I've submitted was about COVID, and I'm sure a lot of people are working on COVID. So will the NIH think, we don't want to fund 2 projects that overlap? Or do they think, this is a very important topic, and here are 2 different angles of looking at this topic, so let's fund a broad proposal?
So I would say, from the review point of view, reviewers are told very clearly, although they don't always follow it, but that each proposal needs to be reviewed independently, that you cannot compare proposals. At the program level, it's possible that program officers will make a decision based on their budget that one project is more crucial than another. But I don't know, Patrick, you're on, Mark,
Yes,
others, what would
I
you say?
would agree with that. And in fact, in the review panels, each project is reviewed kind of independently. And the reason is you never know if there is somebody with conflict of interest from prior discussion. So you are never going to bring back something that has been discussed previously. So that means that, for instance, Magali, your project, if it overlaps with somebody else's project, they are not going to be talking about each other nowhere during the review session.
Yeah. I think this is why it's important to start a conversation with your program officer from the get-go. And in the end, you will need an advocate for, say your grant application is scored, gets a good score, you will need an advocate at the Institute. So it's important to start that conversation early on, and not, I wouldn't worry about other applications coming in in similar areas. That's almost irrelevant. You do your best. You present the best science, and it's basically science is that what you're going to be vetted on. and you need to pass CSR and go on to the institute and have your program officer advocate for the funding of this project.
Thanks, that's very encouraging.
Pam, you had a question?
Yes, thanks. I'm curious, when the reviewers are scoring the proposals, are they rating 1 to 9 on a series of criteria? And what are those criteria? Basically, what are they filling out?
Let me leave it to recent reviewers to talk about this.
Yes, so each
Yoram?
section, as Anne was indicating, the different sections of the grant, each section is reviewed with weaknesses and kind of innovation advantages, and then we give a score in each of those sections, and then we provide an overall score of the whole grant.
But
so ideally,
yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say that overall is a little bit tricky because it's not supposed to be the sum of everything else. It may not even be correlated with how you scored each of the dimensions of the application.
But ideally, at least that's how we are told by the program officers, there has to be some sort of connection that if we indicate a lot of weaknesses in a certain section and therefore the score is potentially not really high, we need to indicate that this is my driving score for the overall grant is this particular section, and this is therefore why I score, perhaps for that section. And then you get when you get the reviews back, you get a sense of in which section, this is, in the ideal scenario, you will get a sense of in which section I could potentially get the worst score that therefore drove kind of the overall score.
Right.
This is from the reviewer's perspective. However, and here comes kind of the nuance, when we go into the review session, as an indicator, only 3 people get assigned each of the grants, even though the review panel might include 15 or 20 people in the review session. What that means is only those 3 people are in charge somewhat to provide an overview of the grant, and everybody else listens to that discussion. And that's when the overall scores play a role, because then reviewers 1, 2, and 3 will provide their overall score. That limits, in some sense, the score that everybody else will provide. Yeah. So the larger the score range that these 3 reviewers provide, the more spread out that the rest of the reviewers will be able to score your application at that point. Right. The narrower the range, the more likely that you get a smaller range overall.
I think Hiram was talking about the preliminary critiques, and those can change. You're given the opportunity to revise your scores at the end. But can I just mention, I'm looking at a review that I recently did, and scored review criteria, number 1 is significance, number 2, investigators, 3 is innovation, 4 is approach, and 5 is environment, plus the overall.
Right, and there is a section of the proposal where you write about the environment, but I definitely haven't emphasized it because a lot of it is typically boilerplate that the university puts in. It doesn't need to be, and you may want to write some additional part of it, but the rest are the sections we were talking about.
Sorry, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I guess one follow-up question would be, are reviewers looking at the budget? Sometimes we might be a little bit overly ambitious with the budget, and I'm wondering how that figures into the review.
Reviewers are supposed, I'm sorry, Aram, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, at least in my last experience from the SSPB, we get a saying on any concerns we may have, but we don't have a saying on the budget reduction or anything that has to do with the actual budget that the grant might end up getting.
Right. So the issue is typically, is the budget, way out of line with what the project is, but you can't go into detail. You can just talk about, as Yoram says, some, what are the concerns, and that's really up to the program people if they decide to fund it.
So as a member of the review panel, we're asked, reviewers will consider whether the budget and the requested period of support are fully justified and reasonable in relation to the proposed research.
Right. I think I don't know, do we have time for one more question if there is one?
I think Patrick may have a comment, or I don't know if there are any other questions.
Dr. Houvelin?
Nope. Okay. Any other comments?
Can I
Questions?
just, something I brought up at the beginning, the NIH CSR program is called Early Career Reviewer Program, ECR, and it's a program aimed to help early career scientists become more competitive as grant applicants through firsthand experience with peer review and to enrich the diversity of CSR's pool of trained reviewers. So,
Terrific,
yeah, great program.
terrific.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. So thanks to everybody else who pitched in, Mark and Iram and Patrick, in helping me with this. And
Thank
I
you,
hope it was
thank you,
useful.
and thank you very much for giving us this excellent session. And thank you
My
everyone for
pleasure.
coming. Please don't forget to sign up in the link that Esmeralda sent out. Excellent, great to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Everyone,
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.
bye.